Good day, learners. Welcome to our history discussion on the guidelines on answering questions in history, answering source-based questions, and answering essay questions. We are going to share the basic skills that you should uphold and that you should use in answering source-based questions and essay questions. Right, we know every subject has got its own specifications, its own answering techniques for questions. So we're going to focus on history, answering techniques for source-based questions and essay questions. This is applicable to both papers, paper 1 and paper 2. And basically, it's a session for all the grades from grade 10, grade 11, and grade 12, because the skills are basically the same. What you should apply when answering source-based questions from grade 10 is the same as how you should answer the source-based questions in grade 12 when you write your metric final examinations. So we are going to share the basic skills on answering both source-based questions and essay questions in this discussion as we are going to make it unfold. Right. In our first part of the discussion, we want to look at the assessment of source-based questions. How are source-based questions assessed? Right. We're going to look at, if you check on this presentation here, we see there is a level of questions according to cognitive level, according to the level of difficulty of the questions. The questions are ranked according to the level of difficulty, according to cognitive demands of the question or cognitive level of demand of the question. We have level 1 questions. In level 1 questions, basically these are the easiest questions that you get in every paper. In every examination, you get level 1 questions, which are the most easy questions, which require the lowest level of cognitive demands. Is the lowest level of cognitive demand for such a type of questions. Level 1, right? What skill is required when you're answering the first part questions is extraction. Extract evidence from the source. What are we saying here? We are saying for these questions, the information or the answers required to answer, the answers that are required for the question, they are basically available in the source. If it's a written source, it means you just have to go and extract the evidence from the source. The evidence is provided in the source. So you just have to go to the source and extract the evidence. And also, this type of questions, they ask you to define historical concepts. You get a question which asks about a definition of a historical concept, a historical term. Define the concept Cold War, for example, when you are doing the origins of Cold War in grade 12. Define communism in grade 11 when you're doing communism in Russia. Or any concept can be asked where you're supposed to define. So basically, we are saying you should be having those historical concepts at your fingertips disposal, and you should be able to define them according to the historical context. And when you're defining concept, you don't need to necessarily repeat the way they are presented in the textbook or the way you saw the concept being presented in the on internet or on any other source. Right. What is required there is the idea. You need to have the idea of the concept and present the idea, present the basic idea of the concept, not just to memorize or try to force your mind to memorize all the words which are used in the description or in the definition that you saw in the textbook. You only need to master the concept and you define it in your own understanding. You define it in your own words. But what is being looked for by the examiner is the concept. Right. That is level 1 questions. And if we check here, our level 1 questions, how much do they contribute on the weighting of the final paper? You see that they are contributing 15 marks or 30% of the whole paper. So what does it mean? It means if you are getting 30% of that question, it's 15 marks and it's contributing 30% of that particular question. It means if you can be able to answer all level 1 questions, and if you can be able to attempt them and be able to answer them correctly, already you have a pass of 30%. You got yourself a level which is allowing you to pass, given that you have attempted all the level 1 questions. This will give you a level 2 percentage score of 30%. So that is why we say in history, it is more difficult for a learner to fail than to pass. It's easier to pass and difficult to fail history. Because given that we have the lowest level questions contributing 30% of a question, definitely you're going to get all those questions and you're going to get them correct and you're going to get your 30%. And you're not targeting 30%, rather, it's just a benchmark. Right. So that is basically with level 1 questions. So when you're checking your source-based questions, they are assessed in that cognitive level of level 1, which requires you to extract evidence from the source, where you just go to the source and just pick evidence. We're going to look at the typical questions that you're going to meet under level 1, where you're supposed to extract evidence. Then we go to level 2 questions. We are going up at the hierarchy of level of cognitive or difficulty. These ones now, they require interpretation of evidence from sources, or explaining information gathered from sources, or analysis of evidence from sources. Right. Basically, these ones, you are interpreting evidence from the sources. You are now dealing with deeper meaning of the sources. You are now dealing with evidence from the sources and also information which is gathered from the different sources. And the contribution or the weighting of these questions is 20 marks out of 50, which is 40%. So we see the level 2 questions, they contribute 40%, which means also that out of the 40%, an average learner can also score better marks in that level, given that they're not very difficult questions. Then from level 2, we move on to level number 3, which is interpretation and evaluation of evidence from sources. We are now engaging with sources. We are dealing with issues like usefulness of a source, reliability of a source. We are looking at bias in the source or limitations of sources. Right, we are comparing and contrasting interpretations and perspectives of sources. In this level here, we are now dealing with, we are now interpreting the sources to actually find out if a source is useful towards a certain study in history, or we are now looking at a source and try to prove if we can safely say this is a reliable information that is provided in that particular source. Or we also want to check on aspects like bias. Is the historian biased in this instance? Or is the historian providing us accurate information which is unbiased? We also look at the things like limitations. We are going to look at these questions in detail as we look at them on particular aspect, one after the other. But that is the idea with level 3 questions. We are dealing with interpretation of and evaluation of evidence from the sources. We are now trying to evaluate how sources are, how reliable a source is, or we are now trying to evaluate how useful a source is towards a study of a particular historical aspect, or we are now looking at the limitations of a source. How much is this source providing? Is this source providing enough information towards a study? Can a new historian be able to understand a historical event based on the information provided in a particular source? So we are now trying to play around with sources and analyze the sources and be able to figure out those aspects of reliability, usefulness, of limitation of sources, of comparison and contrast of sources, and also of analyzing if a source is biased in a given direction. Right. So basically, that is the idea of the ranking of historic questions according to the level of difficulty, according to the cognitive levels from level 1 to number 3, according to the level of difficulty. Right. We need to move on and look at the next part. What are level 1 questions? And what do they require you to do? Or which typical examples were we referring to when we talked about level 1 questions? Right. Level 1 questions, we said they are the easiest questions. We talked about them being extraction questions, whereby you're supposed to extract information from the given source. You find the answer from the given source. You just go to the source, extract relevant information answering the question, and you apply the information to answer the question. That is with level 1 questions. Right. So we are saying level 1 questions require you to extract information like what we have mentioned earlier on. You are extracting information. You are taking information from the source. And define historical concept. Define a given concept. Define concepts like when you are dealing with the Cold War, the origins of Cold War. Define a proxy war. That is a concept, a historic concept. Define the concept capitalism. Define communism. Or all those concepts, you define them according to the historical understanding. Right. In this question, how much do they carry? How many marks do they carry? These questions carry a maximum of 2 marks, which means level 1 questions, for every question, the highest number of marks that you can get for a level 1 or an extraction question is 2 marks. And these 2 marks maximum, they come in one by one, right? We're going to look at our interpretation of mark allocation. But here we are saying if a question is a one by one, the first digit here represents the number of responses. And the next digit represents the number of marks. So whenever you get a one by one, it means you must give one response, and that one response is going to give you 1 mark. For example, name the countries that were involved in a particular historical event. Name the individuals who were actively involved in a particular event. You are naming one, and you're getting 1 mark for that response. It's one response, and the response has got 1 mark. That is 1 by 1, giving you 1 mark. Then we go to 2 marks, which are made up of 2 by 1. Is 2 responses, and each response having 1 mark, which means you are giving 2 different responses in that instance. If a question says, name 2 countries that were part of the communist bloc during the origins of Cold War, or name 2 countries that shared Western Germany after the Yalta Conference, you are now naming. And when you are naming, if it's a 2 by 1, it means you're going to give 2 responses, and each response is having 1 mark. And then when it's a 2 mark question, it's a 2 mark question again, which is made up of 1 by 2. I think you can see this is 1 by 2. It's different from 2 by 1. 2 by 1, it means 2 responses, and each response having 1 mark. And this one is a 1 by 2. 1 by 2, it means you give 1 response, but that response has got 2 marks. So for you to get a 1 response with 2 marks, it means that response must be detailed. You must give a full statement, or you must give a full explanation of that particular event, or of that particular requirement of the question, so that you get 2 marks. You cannot get 2 marks by just listing, or by just naming, or by just stating. This is a question which requires you to give details. For example, it's a definition question. Yes. If it's a definition question, it means you must define it fully. You must give the concept. It must be clear. The concept must be clear if it's a definition. Usually you get a 1 by 2 on definition questions. Define the concept. Define this. Yes. So the responses that you give, you see those 2 questions, they are both 2 mark questions. 2 by 1 is equal to 2, 1 by 2 is equal to 2. But the type of responses that are required by those questions, they are not the same. The response that you give to a 2 by 1, you give 2 different responses. Maybe you're just listing or naming. You name 2, you list 2, you identify 2. But for 1 by 2, in this one here, in this instance, the 1 by 2, you are giving 1 answer. But in that 1 answer, there is a description which is full, or there's an explanation which is full, which guarantees you to get 2 marks in that instance. You cannot just list, or you cannot just name, because that one should be detailed. That one should be a full statement. The answer should be presented in a full statement. Right. That is with a 1 by 2. Right. We go on to the question verbs. List countries that were involved in whatever historical event. Quote from the source. When you are asked to quote, you just go to the source and extract relevant information in regard to the given question. Identify. You are just identifying from the source. You are just picking from the source. Name. You're just giving names. You are just naming. Whoever. If there are countries, you are just naming them. It was the USA. It was Britain. It was France. You're just naming. So that is the level of 1 questions, and how the questions are asked, and basically the question verbs which are used in that particular type of question levels. And typical level 1 questions, like what information in the source tells you about whatever is being asked there, is a typical question which is part of level 1 questions. What information in the source? Which means you must supposed to go to the source and find information which tells you about something. Right. Quote 2 reasons from the source. You are going to the source and just extracting it the way it is presented in the source. If you are quoting, you are just extracting historical information as it is in the given source. You just pick up the relevant information, you just extract only the relevant part of the source and use that as the response to the given question. Right. What do you understand by the term? It means you are supposed to give your understanding of the term, or you are defining that term according to your own understanding in your own words. That is what the question requires. So basically, that is level 1 questions, which you are going to get as part of your source-based questions. Right, we move on to level 2. Right, level 2 requires you to interpret, analyze, and engage with evidence from the sources. We have mentioned that earlier on. It requires you to interpret. You are finding meaning from the source, analyze, and also engage with evidence. Evidence in this source, is it the right evidence that you are getting, or is it a reliable evidence that you are getting in that particular source? These questions carry a maximum of 4 marks. 4 marks in the form of 2 by 2. It means if it's a 2 by 2, we have a very high, there is very high risk with learners losing marks on this type of questions. The 2 by 2. Learners, they tend to ignore the mark allocation, and they tend to provide one response for a 2 by 2 question. 2 by 2, it means 2 responses with each response having 2 marks. So what it means is you cannot give one response for a 2 by 2 question and expect to get 4 marks. Never. You are supposed to give 2 different responses for that question. So those 2 different responses are going to give you 2 marks each for every response, and that is going to be 4 marks for the question. So be mindful whenever you are answering questions, take note of the mark allocation and obey the mark allocation. Do answer the question as per mark allocation so that you get all the marks for every question. If you answer this question in one response, you're going to get maximum 2 marks. Or if some learners, we know, they play around with the language. They present one idea, then they repeat the same idea using different wording. Still, what is being asked for there is a concept or is an idea answering the question, not the wording. So if you present one idea in 2 different wordings, that is not a response which can guarantee you to get 4 marks, because you have just played around with the words and not with ideas or not with historical concepts. So you're going to get maximum 2 marks again. So for that instance, I will urge all learners to pay attention to mark allocation and do what the mark allocation is implying. Answer the question and give the right number of responses according to the mark allocation. So in this instance, if it's 2 by 2, give 2 different responses, and each response is going to give you 2 marks, and the total will be 4 marks for that particular question. Right, we move on to the other the question verbs which are used for that type of questions. We have question verbs like explain, comment, describe, or organize. Those are typical questions that question verbs that are used for level 2 questions. Explain the concept or comment on, describe whatever, or organize information. Yes, that is basically with level 2. Like, for example, what message does the cartoonist convey in regard to a particular event? Maybe it's a cartoon on a particular event. It's a cartoon maybe in paper 1. It's a cartoon on maybe the division of Germany after the Yalta Conference, where Germany was supposed to be split into East and West Germany. Maybe there's a cartoon portraying the 2 extreme sides of communism and capitalism on the origins of Cold War. Maybe when the question message, what message does the cartoonist convey in regard to the tensions between communism and capitalism? You are supposed to identify from the source and figure out the deeper understanding of the source, and find a deeper meaning from the source and extract a message from that particular source. Actually, when a question is saying what message does the cartoonist convey or what message does the picture give, we are not saying what is on the picture. We cannot give you marks, or the examiner cannot give you marks for interpreting, for telling them what is straight on the visual source. You cannot say you are seeing something on the source. It's a visual source. It's showing something which you can actually see, and you give that as a response to the message. That is not a message. A message is asking you about the deeper meaning of what is portrayed on the picture or on the cartoon. We want you to give an interpretation, a deeper understanding according to the historical events. You have studied history, you know what happened. So you are supposed to relate the theory that you have in mind with the interpretation of the source provider or the historian who provides the source, such that we find a deeper meaning of what is being portrayed in that particular cartoon or in that particular picture. Not for you to tell what is being shown on the picture. That is not the message. The question when it asks about a message, in other facts, is asking about the deeper meaning of what is portrayed on the picture. If a picture is showing someone maybe with an exaggerated hand, it's a country, maybe a representative of a country, showing a hand which is an arm which is exaggerated. It has a meaning. You must portray, you must see the deeper meaning of that interpretation of that figure and be able to figure out the message which is being portrayed by that cartoonist. So we're not saying what are you seeing on the cartoon or what are you seeing on the photograph, what are you seeing on the picture. No. When a question is asking about a message, it's asking you about the deeper understanding relating to historical concepts. What is this cartoonist trying to portray given this figure? You now apply your knowledge to what you are seeing on the visual source. Explain in your own words. In your own words, it means you are now applying your own understanding. But what is required there is for you to explain the basic concept. The basic concept must be there, but you should not force yourself to remember the words that were used in the textbook. Or you should not force yourself to remember the same wording that was used on the internet to explain that concept. You explain according to your understanding. As long as the concept is addressed, the response is correct. Right. Why do you think this is a personal analysis question? You're supposed to figure out from your own reasoning. Why is it like that? Why was it like that? And that should be substantiated with the historical facts. Yes. Right, we move on to the next type of questions. This is level 2. We go to level 3. Level 3 questions require you to explain the different perspective of sources. Perspectives of sources, we are saying historians, they sometimes use different perspectives in portraying the same historical event. We have a particular historical event that happened, which is interpreted by different historians. They give us different information, but they are telling us about the same historical event. But the way they are portraying that event, given their perspectives, they are giving us different information. So we as historians in the making, we must be able to figure out and see who is more reliable than the other or among these historians, or which source is more useful than the other among these sources that are provided. Which source has got limitations and what limitations are there? Can we safely rely on this particular source? So we have to draw conclusions about reliability. We're going to talk about that as a particular question on its own. What do we look at for us to say a source is reliable or is unreliable? We also check on usefulness of a source. Or we look at limitations of a source. Or we are comparing sources. Compare source 1A and source 1B with regard to the Berlin Wall, or with regard to the Berlin crisis, with regard to whatever historical event is there. We are trying to look at the different perspectives of sources and see how sources tend to agree with each other, how they tend to be similar to each other, how they tend to contrast each other or oppose each other. That is basically what we are looking at when we are dealing with level 3 questions. We are dealing with the perspective of sources. We are trying now to figure out sense from the different historians' perspectives. This one wrote in this direction because they were believing in this direction. Isn't there propaganda in this source? Were they not willing to make people behave or believe in a particular direction if they were using propaganda? Is there no bias? Is this historian balancing the argument, or they are just one-sided? We check on those things. So basically, we're going to look at also level 3 and check what type of information, what kind of information must we try to figure out from the sources to say this source is limited or this source is useful, this one is unreliable, this one is reliable. Comparing and contrasting sources, what should we check? We're going to look at that in detail as per question. Right, we move on to the type of, the mark allocation is for 2 by 2, which is 4. I'm going to emphasize on that when we look at the different types of source questions in the coming discussion. Right. The question verbs is like compare. When a question is saying comparing, actually it's saying find similarities between sources. If you are comparing, you are looking at similarities. How are these sources similar with regard to a particular historical event? You are checking on one source and also trying to figure out how the other source is portraying the same event in the same understanding or in the same direction. So basically that is with comparison of sources. And also you can also be asked on questions like contrast of sources. When you're contrasting sources, you're looking at how the sources say the opposite. When sources are contrasting each other, they are saying the opposite. It's the opposite of each other. How do they oppose each other? Or how do they contradict with one another? Right. And also comment on. You are giving the deeper meaning of what is portrayed on that particular source. Comment on the statement. This. What does that statement mean in the historical perspective of that particular event? And then justify, give reasons for that particular event. And basically, that is how we tend to get the questions on level 3 questions. So this one gives us the typical type of questions that we find under level 3. We have questions like explain to what extent the evidence in source 1A maybe supports evidence in source 1B with regard to a particular event. Compare the evidence in source 1A and source 1B. That is also another typical question. You find similarities. Comment on the usefulness of a source. This source is useful. Why are you saying it's useful? We're going to look at what you must look at in the source for you to guarantee yourself that a source is useful to a historian who wants to study a particular event. And also reliability. Can we say this source is telling us the truth of the event that happened? Can we rely on this source as the truth? Can we trust this source? Limitations. What information is missing in a particular source? Right. So we are going to look at them in detail, one after the other, as typical types of questions that fall under the source-based section. Right. Then we move on to mark allocation. We have talked about that. When I look at mark allocation, it means the first number is the first digit represents the number of responses required. So it means if you get a 1 by 2, it means one response, and if response giving 2 marks, 1 times 2 gives you a total of 2 there. Then also if you get a 2 by 2, it means you're supposed to figure out 2 responses. 2 responses in that instance, and each response having 2 marks, giving you a total of 4 marks. And here it's a 2 by 2. You must figure out 2 different responses, which are given in detail. For you to get 2 marks for every response, the response must have full details. It must be well explained or well described and fully described in a statement such that you get 2 marks each. And you give another response or another example, which is completely different from the first example. Do not repeat the same concept or do not repeat the same idea and present it differently, using different wording so that you confuse the examiner and try to rob the examiner of marks. You won't win that battle. Do the right thing. Right, we move on to the next mark allocation. This one is talking about the number of marks. If 3 by 1, it means it's 3 responses of 1 mark each. If it's 2 by 2, again, like what I've mentioned earlier, it means it's 2 responses with 2 marks each to give you 4. Right, mark allocation, what does it mean? For you also to be able to figure out the level of difficulty of a question or to figure out the cognitive level or the cognitive demands of a question, you can also pay attention to mark allocation. It can also give you a clue of the level of difficulty of that particular question. 1 by 1 equal to 1. It means that is a low level question, a level 1 question, a listing question, an extraction question, where you're just supposed to find the responses from the given source. 2 by 1, it's a lower level question. It's a listing or naming question. Name or quote evidence, quote 2 pieces of evidence from the source. You're just taking from the source. It's a level 1 question, an extraction one, which is the lowest level and the most easier type of a question. 3 by 1. It's also extraction question. Extract 3 pieces of evidence or 3 examples or 3 names or 3 whatever is there in the source. You're just figuring it out from the source, and you should not even struggle with your fight with your mind to think of the response. The response is already provided, is there, and you must just find it out from the given source. So it's an extraction question, which is a level 1 question. So if you see if you also see a 1 by 2, go and look in the source first. The answer might be there. If it's a 1 by 2, the answer might be there in the source. Or look at the way the question is phrased. You also get a clue from how the question is phrased. You know, the questions are phrased differently. Like, for example, it might be telling you to look in the source. If the question is saying, for example, according to the source, it's a 1 by 2, it's saying according to the source. This is the phrase of the question. If it's saying according to the source, it means there is evidence in the source. And if it says use your own words, if it's saying using your own words, it means you are supposed to figure it out from your own understanding. It's not like it's coming from the source, but you are figuring it out from your own understanding. Right. So that is basically how you should pay attention to mark allocation and also try to figure out if the response is in the given text, in the given source, or you must find it out on your own. Right. So we move on to mark allocation again. We are still doing the same. It's a 2 by 2. It's interpretation or analysis. You have learned from your working order to look at the sources. Understand what is being asked. If you and apply your knowledge and understanding in order to answer the question. So a 2 by 2 equal to 4 is an interpretation question. You are interpreting the evidence from the source. You are figuring out sense from what is provided in the source. Or you are doing an analysis question. You're analyzing the source. Is this source useful? It is to your discretion to determine if a source is reliable or not. Because you as a historian, you have gathered enough evidence from your studies. You are now qualified to judge or to analyze a source and say this source is not reliable and this source is reliable. You can figure it out, aspects of reliability and unreliability of sources, because you have learned the historical concepts and you have learned the information which is in line with a given historical event. You are now qualified enough to justify if a source is reliable or not, or if a source is useful or it is limited, because you now know what happened in those historical events and you have sufficient historical evidence to actually justify and to actually judge if a source is reliable, if it's useful, if it's limited, or all those particular aspects. Right. So it's a 2 by 2 question. You must give 2 responses with 2 marks each for every response. Right. Remember, look at the mark allocation of the question. It's very important. When you're answering questions, learners tend to override the mark allocation. There's no way you can target yourself for a distinction if you're not paying attention to mark allocation. Because at the end of the day, all what you are fighting for in the examination is to get marks. So if you don't pay attention to mark allocation, then what are you doing? You are supposed to reap as much marks as is possible. You are supposed to take as many marks as is possible from the examination. But you can only do so if you pay attention to the mark allocation. If you are giving a listening ear to the mark allocation so that you address what is required in that particular question and you get the maximum marks for that particular question. If it's a 2 by 2 question, you give 1 response. We never know if that response will be correct or wrong. If it's correct, you get maximum 2 marks. If it's wrong, you get 0 out of 4, which is a very big loss to lose 4 marks for a question. Well, at the end of the day, you're not getting to get the remaining 48, 46. You've lost 4 out of 50, you're left with 46. You don't even get the 46. You won't even get the 46. So you should pay attention to mark allocation and try to address what is required by that mark, so that question, so that you are able to get as maximum marks as is possible for every particular question. So look at the mark allocation of the question, and that will guide you as to whether the answer is in the source or extraction, or whether you have to interpret or provide analysis. If you see a 2x2 question, that question reminds you well that the answer is not in the source. It's not an extraction question, because we said with extraction questions, the maximum number of marks is 2 with extraction, which comes as 1x1 or 2x1 or 1x2. This is with extraction question or level 1 questions. So never expect to extract an answer from a source when you see a question is a 2x2 equal to 4 question. You will be wasting your time. And do not have that habit of copying sources. Source-based questions are not comprehension questions. Even comprehension questions, you're supposed to think. You don't get all the answers from the source or from the given text. You're supposed to think. That is why you learn. You do not learn so that you ignore the information that you learned and go to the exam empty-headed and look at the sources to get all answers. There's nothing like that under this world. It's not possible under the sun. It's not possible in the formal learning system. Train yourself to think. Do not just copy sources. It's not a matter of extracting information from the sources and just duplicating the sources to make the examiner get confused. If you're answering a question, address the question requirements. Don't copy the sources. Right. You must interpret the source in this instance or give an analysis. If the question is saying, how does source 1A support source 1B with regard to the split of Germany during the Cold War? The question is asking you to give an analysis and interpretation of the sources. You are supposed to interpret what is in this source, which is the same as in that source. If the question is asking you about contrast evidence in source 1B and source 1C with regard to the Berlin crisis, you're supposed to find how those two sources are opposing each other with regard to that historical event, and not just write, copy sources and duplicate sources. History is not about copying sources, it's about answering questions. And answering questions is not about copying sources. You should be mindful of that whenever you're answering questions. Pay attention to mark allocation, pay attention to question demands. Answer the question and not copy the sources. Right, we move on to the next part. The next part is talking about now the types of questions. Right, the types of questions that we have, we're going to run down through them and also try to summarize them in this discussion, and also try to give you an idea or a clue of how you should answer those typical questions which fall under the source-based section. Right, we have a question which asks about how do sources support each other. We have a support question. How does source 1A support source 1B with regard to a particular historical event? How does source 1A support source 1B with regard to war communism? Maybe it's grade 11, you're looking at communism in Russia. It's a source on war communism, source 1A and source 1B. They are both talking about war communism. So we want to see how they support each other. Or you are looking at maybe it's grade 12, paper 1, you are dealing with Angola, independent Africa. Maybe how does source 1A support source 1B with regard to the Battle of Quito Carnival? You're looking at the Angolan history, the Battle of Quito Carnival. You're looking at how do those two sources support each other, right? So you're supposed to figure out how those two sources are similar to each other. You pick an event and also compare how it is portrayed in the next source in a similar way, right? Then compare and contrast. This one's also comparison, its similarity. Contrast is the opposite or the differences. Sources might be different in the way they portray some other events. So you must also be able to figure out how those sources differ from each other. And also you must be able to identify bias from a given source. Is this source biased? How is this source biased? You have to figure out and see the extent of bias in a given source. We're going to look at it in detail as a particular historical aspect, which is found in different sources. You find some historians, they are biased and they tend to provide information which is unbalanced. We have also to look at that. Then also have to get questions on the reliability of sources. Reliability, is the source reliable? Is the source accurate? Is this the truth of what happened? Can we safely trust this source? That is with the reliability. Then usefulness, we're also going to analyze it. Usefulness, is this source useful? And if you are checking on the usefulness of a source towards someone who wants to study a particular historical event, we are saying, how much information are they getting? What new information are they learning? What is the source relevant to a given study? What information is being provided which is useful, which is tangible towards someone who wants to study a particular historical event? Right? That is with usefulness. We're going to look at it in detail. Then limitations is also another type of question which we're going to look at. When a source is limited, it means it has insufficient information. It might be insufficient information, or it's failing to mention some obvious things that must be mentioned in a particular historical event. You're talking about maybe the source is talking about maybe it's grade 12, the origins of Cold War. It's talking about the split of Germany into East and West. And it fails to mention who occupied the West, who occupied the East. That is very critical information and obvious information that must be mentioned in a source. You are talking about the split of Germany into two, into West Germany and East Germany. Or you're talking about the split of Germany into East and West Berlin, into East and West Berlin. You are failing to mention the countries which occupied the East and which occupied the West, because that is very obvious information. Or if a source is neglecting, we're going to look at that in detail. If a source is also giving wrong information, inaccurate information, it's limited. Right. Let's go to the next part and see how these sources are answered and how these questions are answered, these typical source-based questions. Right. We start with the support question. How does source 1A support source 1B with regard to a particular event? That is a support question. Support, right. How does source 1A support source 1B with regard maybe to, maybe it's the Berlin Wall, right, or the Berlin blockade. It's grade 12, origins of Cold War. How does source 1A support source 1B with regard to the Berlin blockade or the Berlin Wall? This question is asking you how the two sources are similar. Be mindful of that. You must see how source 1A is similar to source 1B with regard to the events of the Berlin Wall or the Berlin blockade. What do they have in common? What are the similarities? What do they have in common? What common sharing do they have in terms of the information that they are portraying? What are they sharing which is the same? That is the question. So what you do, be mindful when you are answering this question. Be specific. Answer it specifically according to the given prescription of answering the question. Do not write anything else which is outside the prescribed format of answering the question. You might be wasting your time trying to explain things which won't give you even a single mark, because you are not answering the question, you're not addressing the question. Address the question specifically and be able to figure out sense from, in your answer, you must be able to portray sense from what you are describing there. So what you do is, you go to source 1A. If the question is saying, how does source 1A support source 1B? Source 1A supports source 1B with regard maybe to the Berlin Wall. You go to source 1A, find something there. Maybe source 1A, it's a written text. And source 1B, it's a picture. Source 1A is saying the wall was built, there was a concrete wall which was built. It's a description of the wall. And source 1B is also showing a concrete wall. Those two sources are portraying the same information. They are supporting each other. This one is describing the wall being made of concrete, and this one is also portraying an image of a concrete wall. It's a similarity. So what you do in your answer, you have found that in source 1A, they are talking of a concrete wall. The wall was made of concrete in the written source. And in the visual source, you are seeing that it's a concrete wall which is being shown in the picture. You have found a support between those two sources. You have found a similarity between the two sources. Then how do you portray, how do you give out your answer? How do you write your answer? In your answer, you say, right, this is the only prescribed way of answering this question. Do not explain anything or do not write anything else. Just go to the prescribed way of answering the question. Write, source 1A says the Berlin Wall was made of concrete. And this is supported by source 1B, which shows a concrete wall. You are done. You get your 2 marks, because you have shown how the two sources are supporting each other. Then you go back and find another example. Be very mindful. Find another example, not the same example. You have talked about a concrete wall. We know a concrete wall is a concrete wall. You are done with that. Go and find another example which is different from the idea of a concrete wall. Maybe the first source is explaining the height of the wall. The wall was 3 meters high. And you go to the source, the visual source. Plus or minus, you can justify that this is a very high wall, which can be plus or minus 3 meters. It's another example of a similarity between those two sources. You again use the same format. Source 1a says the Berlin Wall was 3 meters high. This is supported by source 1b, which shows a very high concrete wall. You are dealing with the height here. This one is written, it shows that the wall was 3 meters high. And this one is showing a tall wall, which can be justified to be plus or minus 3 meters. Or the first source says the wall was guarded 24/7 by armed police and the army. And you also see evidence in the visual source. There are some police officers and there are some army officers who are by the wall. That is another example. You say source 1a says that the wall was guarded 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, like by armed police officers and the army. This is supported by source 1b, which shows the police officers and the armed army officers along the wall. That is a comparison. That is a support. You are done with that question. So you give two different responses for you to get a maximum of 4 marks. It's a 2x2 question, which guarantees you to give two responses, and each response having 2 marks, you get your total of 4 marks for that particular question. Right. We go on to compare or contrast. In this instance, the compare part is almost the same as support question because they are asking about similarities. But if you're talking about the contrast question is asking about the contradiction. If a question says contrast, it means the two sources are disagreeing with one another. They are giving us two different sets of information which are failing to agree with each other. They are not actually agreeing with one another in the way they are portraying the same historical event. So we are looking at the differences or the similarities or how the two sources oppose each other. How do they say the opposite of each other? Right. That is with contrast questions. So we are saying, how are the sources opposite to each other, or how do they say the opposite thing? That is with a contradict question or a contrast question. So what you do, you go to the first source, find an idea there. Maybe you will use an example of Great Gulf again. Maybe you are looking at the origins of Cold War. Maybe in the first source, they are saying, maybe it's a source explaining about people escaping from the east, escaping via the Berlin Wall to West Berlin. Maybe it's portraying life in the East and the West. The same sources are disagreeing with one another. Maybe one source is saying there was very high unemployment in East Berlin. And the other source is also talking about East Berlin, but is saying life was good for people in East Berlin. They were having jobs. It's a contradiction. One is saying there was high unemployment, and one is saying people were having good life, they were employed. Those two sources are giving us different information, but they are talking about the same space. They are talking about the East Berlin, but they are portraying East Berlin differently. Or some people say, some other source says, people in East Berlin, they were very happy with their government. It was a government that obeyed human rights. And then the other source is describing the very same government as a fascist government, a government which was lawless, which disregarded human rights. We are talking of the same government, but it's portrayed differently. So it means those two sources are contradicting each other, or they are saying the opposite of each other. They are not agreeing with each other, but they are talking about the same particular historical event, but they are not portraying it the same. Or they are talking about the same historical figure, but the way they are portraying the figure is different. That is with contrast questions. So you answer it the same way you answer the comparison or the support question. You say in your answer, right, source 1a says this. Source 1a says people in East Berlin, they were very contented with their life. They were having jobs. And this is contradicted, or this is contrasted by source 1b, which says there was very high unemployment in East Berlin. You have answered the question. You have addressed the effect of employment in both the sources. One is saying people were having jobs, and the other one is saying there was very high unemployment. Those two sources are disagreeing with each other. Maybe another example, you go and find another example of contradiction. Maybe the other source is saying people were very contented with their life. They were happy and they were getting all the basics. And the other source is saying people were fleeing from East Berlin because of the crisis. It's an opposite thing. People cannot run away from good life. If it's portraying people running away from East Berlin, trying to escape to the West, it shows that they were not happy with the way of life that they were experiencing in the East. It's an opposite thing. So basically, that is what you check. If you want to contrast sources, find an example of something and find how the same thing is portrayed in the other source differently. If it's portrayed differently, then that acts as an example of a contrast between the two sources, and it's justifiable example of how those two sources are disagreeing with one another in regard to that particular historical event. Right. Then this is a 2x2 question. You have your 2 marks for one response and another response and another example. You get your other 2 marks, then you make them 4 marks, which is maximum for that particular type of question. Right. We'll go on to the next aspect. This one here is not a type of a question, but it's basically an interpretation of the sources and analysis of sources for you to be able to figure out aspects like reliability of a source. If you want to figure out if a source is reliable, you check on aspects like bias. If a source is biased, it means it's unreliable. Or you want to check on limitation of a source. If there is bias in a source, it means it's limited. It's not providing you accurate and sufficient information. Or on usefulness, you can also check on bias in the source. If a source is biased, then it means that source cannot be useful enough for one who wants to study something because it's giving biased information. Right. So what is bias? When a historical source is biased, it means it gives only one point of view, or it gives one perspective, or it gives the perspective of the writer and not the reality. If you are giving you're providing historical evidence based on feelings, you are not providing the reality of what happened because you're using emotions to portray whatever happened. Maybe it's out of hatred, maybe it's out of you being an affiliate to whatever you're explaining. You do not use your feelings to portray whatever happened, but you must use the justification of what happened, and you must give the rightful information of what happened and not using your emotions. So it is one country or one person's perspective or an opinion or a thought or a feeling on a particular matter. Whenever we have one person's opinion for a country, we are talking about the Cold War tensions, and the two extreme economic systems are blaming each other for the crisis, for the world crisis, or for the disobedience, for misgovernance of the world economies. If it's a communist bloc, they will ultimately talk good of communism and blame capitalism. And if it's a source from the capitalist world, if they are also talking of the good side of capitalism and blaming communism, that is bias now because they are giving their own perspective or their own opinion or a feeling on a particular matter. Right. So a source is also biased if it offers a limited view of something. We know well that there should be information which should be provided because of us being in a position to have studied history. We know what happened. So if a source is providing limited information about a particular historical event, that source we can also guarantee that is biased. And also, if a source is too negative or too positive, it's also biased. What are we saying here? Too strongly negative or too strongly positive does not accept anything good from the other side. It's positive. It's negative completely, and it does not accept anything good. It's a source from the communist side, which is explaining about capitalism. They are only talking about the negative implications of capitalism and not even saying anything good about capitalism. That source is unbalanced. We cannot say capitalism is completely bad or capitalism is an evil. Can be an evil in some other direction, but with also its good. on some other perspective if you look at it in a deeper understanding. Or is talking about completely positive things and nothing negative. Does not admit anything negative. That is, source is also unbalanced and is most likely to be biased. Then we also look for emotive words. If a historian is using emotive words, you use emotions more than reasoning. That source is also biased. If you check on a source and you also find that there's emotive language, which is being used there, like you describe a government as a fascist government, as a dictatorial government, as a lawless government, that is emotion. You use too strong negative language. That is emotive words. Those words cannot guarantee a source to be reliable because we all understand that if you're using emotions, we tend to describe some other things, or we tend to override the reality and expose towards an extent which is not justified. Or if you can also check on aspects like if a source is having propaganda, it's also biased. If the source was written to make people behave or believe in a particular direction, we want people to hate some leader, and then we portray negative image of that particular leader, then that is propaganda. We are using that source to make people behave or believe in a particular direction and not actually the reality of what was happening on the ground. So that is propaganda. That is wrong. That is also a guarantee of us to say a source is biased because of it having a propaganda. Right, move on to the next part. We are done with bias. Reliability. And I'll just summarize on the reliability. Right. When you are checking on the reliability, you must ask yourself, is this source accurate? And can we trust this source? That is with reliability. Check on those two. Is this the accurate thing of what happened? Is this source providing us with accurate information? And can we safely trust this source? That is what you must check. And for you to be able to answer those questions, for you to say, this source is accurate and this source is trustworthy, there must be something also that you should check. You cannot just safely conclude that this source is accurate without analyzing the accuracy of that source. Or you cannot safely conclude that you trust a source without analyzing the aspects of the source. So what are you supposed to analyze for you to say this source is accurate and this source can be trusted historically? You check on aspects like who wrote the source. Who wrote the source? Check on the author of the source. When you're looking at reliability, we are saying sources written by historians, they are more likely to be reliable than sources which are provided by laymen in history. People who have been studying history, who are specialists in history, we know they have got knowledge in the field of history. So whichever source that was written by a historian, maybe you find a source was written by a professor in the Department of History at the University of Cape Town. Right. That source is more reliable because it was written by someone in the field of history who is a specialist in the field of history, who has been in the field for long. But also, we cannot safely conclude that because it's from a historian and a specialist in the field. Also check on bias, if it's not biased. If it has bias, it means we cannot safely rely on that source, even though it is coming from a renowned historian. Right. And also, when was the source made? Here, we are looking at the time frame. Sources that were, maybe before I look at that, who wrote it here? Also, we have first-hand information or primary source. Primary sources are also more reliable. If someone is narrating an event and they were involved in a particular event, maybe you're talking about apartheid, we're talking about the Sharpeville massacre of 1960. Maybe someone was involved actively in the Sharpeville massacre. They were there. We can safely rely on that source because it's a primary source. It's a first-hand information that you are getting. We are getting a person who was involved in a particular event who is narrating the story of what happened. We can safely rely, unlike relying in second-hand information or third-hand information. Someone was told of a story, they are telling us a story which they were also told of. They might misrepresent some facts, or they might forget some other important facts because they were not involved directly. So it means first-hand information or primary sources are more reliable than secondary sources. And also, when was the source made? We are looking at the time frame. Sources which were made at the time of the event, they are more reliable. If they were made at the time of the event, we are talking of the Sharpeville massacre, and the source was written in 1960 in August. That source is more reliable because its time frame is coinciding with the historical event. Unlike we are given a source in 2024 or 2025, that source is explaining about an event which happened in 1960. That source might be unreliable. It's more likely to be unreliable because of the time factor. Time has lapsed. So many years have passed. Information is going to get lost and some information is going to be forgotten, some important information. Or there might be some representation of facts because of the time factor. Why was it created? We also check on this for reliability. Why was the source created? Can give us an idea of reliability. If a source is created for propaganda, maybe it's a poster whereby black people are mobilizing each other to go for a meeting to fight against apartheid oppression. That poster might be unreliable because they might portray apartheid as the worst evil on earth because they want people to behave in a given direction. It's a propaganda. That is why they created the source. If it's informative, we want people to learn and know about a particular event. We can safely rely on that source because it will be neutral and it will be having either side of the story. It has all the information which it should provide. So we can safely rely on that, given the reason why. And then also you check on evidence in the source. Is it consistent with evidence from other sources or from another source? We are looking at consistency, or what we call in other instances corroboration of sources. A source is reliable if it's saying the same as other sources or if saying the same as another source. Say, for example, we're looking at Cold War, the origins of Cold War. One source is saying, for sure, we know we have historical evidence because we have studied history. It's talking about the split of Germany, right? One source is saying Germany was split into East Germany and West Germany and was shared among as the superpowers. We know that is historically correct. And then there's another source which is saying Germany was divided into North and South Germany. It's not coinciding. It's not actually consistent with other sources. It's not giving the same information as other sources and also giving us wrong information because we know well that it was divided into East and West. So we cannot rely on that. We cannot rely on that particular source because it's not giving us consistent evidence with other sources. It's not corroborating with other sources. It's actually giving us the wrong information. That is with reliability. So you check on those aspects. We want to check if a source can be trusted and if a source is accurate. That is all one reliability. Then we move on to usefulness. We want to also analyze on question of analysis, level 3 questions. We are also tasked to analyze if a source is useful or if a source is limited. Usefulness, we are looking at what substance matter do we get in that particular source. And is it relevant to an investigation? We want to know about the tensions during the Cold War. Is it giving us enough information or is it giving us anything tangible for us to substantiate it as a useful source? That is what we are looking for. So in this instance, we are saying the usefulness of the source depends on the purpose of the source. What is the source being used for? We want to know about some event. And is this source providing us information in line with that particular event that we want to study? That is usefulness. If it's not giving us information, then the source is not useful. What is the source being used for? Is it relevant to my investigation? How reliable is the source? We also check on those aspects. Right. You focus on the message of the source. Assess whether the information in the source can be used for the period or event under discussion. Is the source providing us information that can be relevant towards the study or that particular event? Is it in line with that particular event and what is it providing us with? So what I usually check, what I usually want you to note when you're looking at usefulness, a source can be useful maybe if it gives you names. Maybe it's giving you names of people who are involved in the formation of the ANC. We are looking at grade 11 African nationalisms. It's talking about the formation of the ANC. who was involved in the formation. It's giving you names of the people. It's useful information. It's giving you the time factor. When was it formed exactly? In which year? In 1912. You know that this political party was formed at this particular time. You have it. It's useful information. If it's giving the statistics, how many people were supporting ANC by then? It tells you that maybe it was only being supported by just a few black minorities in the homelands. It's also useful information. Or if it gives you the reasons why the ANC was formed, there are reasons or justifications. It's useful information. You get to know that it was relevant for the ANC to be formed because of these injustices. Why was it formed in the first place? To address the injustices of apartheid or whatever, or of segregation. That is useful information. So you check what is provided in the source, which is of substance or which is tangible towards you understanding the historical event better. That is usefulness. Then you go to limitations. Limitations, we are saying, of what quality is the source? Can we say is this source is quality, or this is a source of just a source without useful or useful information? Is it providing the right information that we want to know? And is it providing sufficient information with regard to a historical event that we want to study? So you'll be looking at things like reliability and bias on limitation, yes. And whether that will point you to usefulness of the source. If a source is not useful, it means it's limited. It's not providing you enough. For example, a source may be limited because it only presents one side or one point of view. It is biased. And biased source is limited if it only presents one view. We are talking about the Cold War. You only talk about communism side and ignore capitalism side. That source is unbalanced. It gives one point of view, therefore it's limited. We won't get to know the other side's story because they're only telling us about one side. It's one-sided, it gives one point of view, therefore it's limited, and it's biased in that direction. Right. Or maybe limited because the source is not accurate or consistent. If it's not accurate, it's giving us wrong information. We are looking at the South African War as an example. That's grade 10. We are looking at the Anglo-Boer War. The source is telling us that by the end of the war, the British were defeated by the Boers. That is completely wrong information. We know the results of the war, and we know what happened because we have studied history. So that source is limited because it's giving us inaccurate information. It's giving us wrong information. Or we are told of, we're talking about the Battle of Quito Canaveral in Angola, that's grade 12. And then the source is telling us that South Africa ultimately won in the Battle of Quito Canaveral. The result, we know that it was a deadlock. No side accepted defeat. No side won the war. It ended in a deadlock. But it's telling you that which other side won the war because it's biased towards that side. That is wrong information or inaccurate information. We can say that source is limited because it's giving us inaccurate information. It's not accurate, or is not consistent with other sources. It's providing information which is contradicting with other sources. It's telling the opposite of what other sources are saying. That source is unreliable. It's limited in that direction. So basically, that is how you answer those questions, and be mindful of the mark allocation when you attempt such questions. Be sure that you attempt the questions to the best possible number of responses that are required so that you are able to get all the marks for that particular question. Right. We have to move on to paragraph questions, which is also part of our source-based questions, which is an 8-mark question. I'm going just to highlight there how you answer a paragraph question and also try to make it simple. Right. Our paragraphs, this is an 8-mark question. We have typical problems with learners who tend to ignore paragraph questions. There's no way you can ignore 8 marks out of 50. Because if we say 50 minus 8, you are left with 42. And in those 42 questions, there are also 2 by 2 questions, which you will also give one response and miss the other 2 marks. At the end of the day, you get a low mark because of neglect of some aspects in the examination or in the questions. You say paragraphs are hard, I won't try them. Paragraphs are the easiest questions that you can ever attempt in a history examination. And they are the questions which can allow you to maximize your marks. Because these questions here, they are just a matter of application of the skill that you must have. You have the skill at the disposal of your fingertips and apply it to the relevant question and be able to reap the maximum marks for that particular question. There's nothing difficult with paragraph questions, to assure you. Right. Paragraphs, they come at the end of every source-based question. And they are based on the topic in the question. So when you get a question, again, the question has got a topic. Question number 1, maybe it's grade 12. Question number 1, paper 1, the origins of Cold War. Maybe the guideline of the question or the theme of the question is talking about maybe the Berlin airlift. You know that the paragraph question is going to come on the Berlin airlift. The moment you check the topic of the question, the sources below explaining the Berlin airlift, which was implemented after the Berlin blockade. Right. So you know that the source, the paragraph question is going to be based on the Berlin airlift. It's going to ask you on the Berlin airlift. The guideline of the topic of the question is going to give you the same as the paragraph question at the end of your source-based question. So this question is worth 8 marks. It's an 8-mark question. A paragraph question is 8 marks. And how is it assessed? It is assessed holistically using an analytical rubric. So when the question is being marked here, we are not marking the number of points that we have raised in that particular paragraph. But what is looked for by the examiner there is the format of the question and how much you have attempted to answer the question and how you have attempted to answer the question in the prescribed format of writing a paragraph. That is all. It's assessed as one, not as units of ideas. So you must not count your number of points. Like you want to say, I have raised 4 points in this paragraph, then I'm going to get 4 by 2, I'm going to get 8 marks. That is not. The paragraph is assessed holistically. The examiner is going to read through the paragraph, the whole paragraph, and figure out how much have you answered the question and what sense have you actually derived from the answering of the question and how much have you attempted to follow instructions in answering the question according to the paragraph format. Then you get a mark according to the levels, level 1, level 2, level 3. The question is phrased so that it is a level 3 questions. Yes, it's level 3 question. For example, explain the role, the impact or causes, effect or significance of a particular historical event. Yes, it's a level 3 question which requires you to apply or analyze the sources. The paragraph question always relates back to the key question. Yes, the key question is the guideline of the question that is on the question topic. So the paragraph question, like what I mentioned earlier on, it's like the paragraph question is based on the key question in the heading of the question. Right. Using information from relevant sources and your own knowledge. That is where the problem comes here. Using information from the relevant sources. We are not saying all sources have got relevant information in answering the question. Some sources might not be having information which answers the question. That is why the question is saying relevant information from relevant sources. You can only take from the relevant sources and not from every source. And also your own knowledge. If there's no part of own knowledge there, it means your paragraph is incomplete. There's need for own knowledge and evidence from all relevant sources. Write a paragraph explaining whatever there. Right. What I'm going to do here is this one here is telling you about how you extract facts from the paragraph and how you do. I'll just summarize and give you a clear and precise way of writing paragraphs. Right. What you must do here, you must not waste time. What you must do when you are answering the question, right? The first thing is to answer the question when you're answering a paragraph. Answer the question first. Right. Maybe the question is saying, using the information from relevant sources and your own knowledge, explain the impacts of the Berlin Wall on the citizens in East Berlin. Right. That is the question. Explain the impacts of the Berlin Wall on the East Berliners? That's the question, for example. You must answer the question first. If a question is asking you about the impact of the Berlin Wall on the East Berliners, give us a clue of how they were impacted by that wall. The building of that wall, was it good to them or was it bad to them? Did it give them benefits or they were actually disadvantaged by the erection of the wall? You must answer the question. So, for example, if you're answering that question, you start it by the Berlin Wall posed very negative impact on the East Berliners. You are showing that you are answering the question. You are having a stance. You are having a line of argument. Or if it's positive, the Berlin Wall brought good to the East Berliners. You're answering the question. But the question is saying, explain the impacts. If it's impact, we know you can be positively impacted or you can be negatively impacted. Then you have answered the question or you have taken a stance or you have taken a line of argument. That is what is required in a paragraph. Before you explain anything, we must see the direction of your paragraph, or we must see the line of argument that you are going to sustain in that paragraph. What is the direction of your argument? What is the stance that you are taking? Are you on side A or on side B of the argument? Then you have indicated the stance or you have answered the question. Then the next thing that you must do from there is to use your own knowledge now to explain why you are saying so. You now apply your own knowledge. This is where own knowledge applies. You apply your own knowledge, you explain in your own words. Remember, when you're answering a paragraph question, you are following the PUL format. Don't forget. We are using the PUL format. There must be a point. Then you must give explanation. Then you must give evidence. Then you must link back to the line of argument. So our point is in the answer. Explain the impact of the Berlin Wall on East Berliners. You have shown the impact. There is a point. There is an answer to the question. There's a line of argument. There's a stance. You have shown that the impact was negative on the East Berliners, or it was disastrous for them. It posed very serious challenges on their lives. It's an answer to the question. It's a stance. It's a line of argument. That is a point. Then you explain in your own understanding. Why are you saying that the East Berliners were exposed to a very negative implication by the construction of the Berlin Wall? You explain in your own words. What I advise you to do, if you don't have your own knowledge, or if your own knowledge is encompassed in the sources, change information from the sources to your own words. You got an idea from source 1A. Maybe source 1A is saying that the East Berliners were deprived of access to their families in the West. Take the idea and explain it in your own understanding, in your own words. It becomes part of your own knowledge. So you are saying, explaining why you said the East Berliners were posed with a negative implication by the Berlin Wall. You are now explaining why you are saying so that it was negative for them. You explain that they were blocked off from visiting their immediate family members who were in the West. They were also denied of their right to employment. They were working, some of them were actively employed in the Western Berlin side. But however, because of the wall, they were denied access to their workplaces. Some of them were also denied access back to their homes. Some had visited to the east, and however, they could not go back to their homes in the west. You are explaining in your own words. You explain maybe 3 statements in your own words. And remember, when you are explaining in your own words, you are not quoting anything. Whatever evidence is found in the source without a quotation, it means it's your own knowledge. Do not put own knowledge in brackets. Like you are quoting, you are indicating that it's own knowledge. Right? Whatever you write without any quotation is own knowledge. But the risk here is if you take an idea from the source, which is definitely there in the source, and you don't acknowledge, now that is plagiarism. You are taking information from the source and claiming it's yours. Because if you don't acknowledge the source where you got the idea, and the definite thing is the information is yours or the idea is yours. And then when the idea is in the same source, then that is plagiarism. That is also going to give you a very poor mark because you're just copying and you're not editing the source where you got the idea from. Then we go on from there. You have explained using your own knowledge. Then we go to this part here. You're now using the evidence from the source. The evidence must be relevant. You are saying in your line of argument, the Eastern Berliners were posed with a great challenge or their lives were negatively affected. Show us how they were affected. Here, you are now giving evidence. Source 1b. That is where you got the idea. You put the idea first, then you put the source in brackets. Give the idea of how they were impacted, then put the source in brackets. What we are saying here, we're not saying copy or quote the statement from the source, because some of the statements might be very long. And those long statements, they are going to make you write a paragraph of 3/4 a page, which is not recommended also for you to write a long paragraph question up to 3/4 a page. So take the idea from the source and present the idea. What is required is the idea of the impact and reference it where you got the idea, not to quote how it is portrayed in the source. Right. Then you go to the last part. You link your evidence. Linking, we are saying, refer back to your line of argument. You have said the impact was negative. Then show us that the impact was negative. The above evidence clearly shows that the East Berliners were subjected to very negative and dire situations of their lives because of the Berlin Wall. You are ending your paragraph. You are linking it back to the fact that you said it was negative for them. Or you give a statement which suggests that life was not good for the East Berliners. Living standards of the East Berliners drastically went down. They could not work. It's a linking statement at the end of the paragraph. You are showing that they were negatively impacted. Their living standard went to a drastic level. It went down drastically because of the fact that they could not go to their workplaces because of the Berlin Wall. That is all. You are done with your paragraph. You have linked back to a line of argument. So basically, that is how you answer paragraph questions. And the moment you address these basics, you give an answer to the question or a line of argument, or you put your point, you explain in your own words, then you give evidence, you quote the evidence, you write the sources in brackets at the end of the statement or at the end of the idea. Then you link back to a line of argument at the end of the paragraph. Then your paragraph qualifies to be a level 3, which is between 6 and 8 marks, and which is very achievable to get 8 out of 8 for a paragraph question. Right. Then lastly, we're going to look at the skills of answering essay questions. You know well that in every examination, you are supposed to choose either 2 source-based questions and 1 essay question, or 2 essays and 1 source-based question. So there's no way you can run away from writing essays in the history examination. So I'll just briefly go through writing an introduction of an essay. Right, when you're answering an essay, look at the question you have been asked. Our essay questions, I'll just briefly highlight. We have 3 types of questions. Questioning that are used for the essays, right? One question says, to what extent? And then the other one, it says, critically discuss. Discuss. And then the other one would say, do you agree? These are the 3 settings of the questions in every examination. Either to what extent, or critically discuss, or do you agree? These are the questions. So identify the question verb, identify the topic point, what focus of the essay. We know our essays in paper 1 and paper 2, right? What is the restrictive weight? Is there a date, or is there argument based on? If there's a date, maybe it's talking about internal the Black consciousness movement between a given set of years, or it's talking about the Vietnam War between a given set of years. Yes, you must also pay attention to the time frame so that you don't go out of the prescribed time frame of the question. In the introduction, after you actually see the question, in the introduction, you must take a stance. Taking a stance, it means you're taking a line of argument. Right. What are we saying here? If a question is saying to what extent, you are taking a line of argument by showing the extent. This is where the question is. You want the extent. So it means it's either a greater extent or a lesser extent, depending on your argument. Whenever you're answering this question here, address the extent part. Take a stance, take a line of argument based on the direction of the argument. If it's an extent, either greater extent or lesser extent. If a question is saying critically discuss, it means you're going to provide both positive and negative arguments for the matter. Positive and negative arguments. You give the other side of the story and the other side of the story again. Do you agree? Here you are either agreeing or disagreeing in your line of argument. If you are agreeing, make sure you have evidence to support your agreement to the matter. And if you are disagreeing, also make sure that you have evidence to support your argument side of the story. That is all. Then you also give what is going to be discussed in the essay. Give what you call an elaboration of what is going to be discussed. So you take a line of argument and you give a reason for that. Line of argument, you take a stance. If you are agreeing, maybe you are saying, is paper 1, grade 12, question number 1. Sorry for using the same example through and through. Right. Maybe with all the might power of the USA, it could not defeat a small nation of peasants. Do you agree with the statement? You are agreeing that despite all the might power of America, they failed to defeat a small nation of peasants. Why are you saying so? You give a general reason as to why you are saying so. This is so because America, despite its strategies, its conventional war strategies, they ultimately were defeated by the Vietnamese in the Vietnam War between which year to which year. That is a general reason. Then you give us what is going to be discussed in the essay. What is the essay going to prove? What historical evidence is going to be used in the essay? This essay is going to further elaborate on the Vietnam War and the ultimate defeat of America by the Vietnamese in that particular war. Your introduction is fine. It must have those 3 basics. It must have an answer to the question, which is a line of argument. Then it must also have a reason why you are taking that line of argument. Why are you arguing in that direction? If it is a critically discuss, you give either side of the story when you are giving a reason. You give a reason on one side and also give a reason on the other side because it's a critical discussion. It must be a balanced discussion, not one-way discussion. And then you give your line of argument. You give what is going to be proven by the essay, what is the essay going to prove. Right. Then that is all with your introduction. Then on your body, remember, in your body, you follow the pill format, always as usual. Every paragraph, it must be chronological, meaning to say you must present your ideas in chronological event happenings of the event, and also must have examples. Right. Present a point, a clear point. At the opening part of your paragraph, the reader must be able to figure out what you are going to say in the paragraph by seeing the first statement. Your first statement of the paragraph must not wander around. It must give a clear statement of what you're going to say in that paragraph. It must give a clear point. It must give a clear fact of what you're going to say in that paragraph. Maybe you're talking of American strategies in the Vietnam War. Talk of the strategy, the name of the strategy in the opening statement of every paragraph so that the reader knows that you are arguing on this particular war strategy. You're talking of the Hamlet, strategic Hamlet. You're talking of the Operation Rolling Thunder. You're talking about the chemical warfare. You're talking about indicate in the opening statement of your paragraph so that the reader knows what you are going to explain in that paragraph. Then, after highlighting the statement, you explain. You are giving evidence. You're giving more information about the strategy. How was it used? How was Operation Rolling Thunder used? What kind of a strategy was it? And what was it targeting to achieve at the end of the war? Then you also give evidence. Give supporting evidence. Evidence comes in different dimensions. It can be evidence of names of places, can be evidence in the form of names of people, can be evidence in the form of statistics, names of places, can be evidence, anything which is tangible historically, or in the form of dates. That is the evidence that you are looking at there to substantiate your argument or to validate your argument. Then after that, you link back to your line of argument. Give a closing statement at the end of your paragraph, which refers back to the opening statement of your paragraph, which is a link. You refer back to your question. How is that paragraph linking to the question that America failed to defeat? How did the strategy make America lose? Or how did the strategy make the Vietnamese win in that particular war? That is linking back to your line of argument or to your introduction statement. Then you go to your conclusion. You just format your paragraphs in the same format. Every paragraph must be in the pill format. Point first, you explain your point, you give evidence or examples, you link it back to your line of argument. That is the format of every paragraph as you write your essay. Then we go on to the last part of the writing of the essay question. That's the conclusion. When you are concluding your essay, we are saying you are now wrapping up your discussion. You are now coming to the end of your discussion. You are summing up your points. What you must do there, you must not introduce any new evidence in your conclusion. You talk about something that you never mentioned about in the body of the essay. You are not ending a story. You cannot end a story by telling someone something new. They would want to know more about that particular thing that you have told them, which means you cannot end a conversation by telling someone something new, which means you must just remind someone of what you have just told them earlier on to show that you are ending a conversation. You are summing up your main points that you made in the body of the essay. Just summing up without repeating them the way you said them. You're just highlighting on what you think is most critical in the writing of your body of the essay, or what you think is most important, or restate the main points or main line of argument. Restate it. Show how actually America lost in that war, and show how actually the Vietnamese won that particular war. You are restating the main line of argument. Then you round off your argument by reverting back to the question or the line of argument. That is how basically you can sum up your discussion along those lines. Then that is your conclusion, and that will be a full essay that is got a proper introduction and the body, which is made up of paragraphs in peel, and ultimately the ending of the paragraph has got a conclusion which is contextualized. What we say here in the conclusion, it should be contextualized. Contextualized meaning to say it should be in line with the question. You cannot have a conclusion which is not addressing the question. Your conclusion must be in line with the question. So it means when you are saying a conclusion is contextualized, it means it is in line with the question which was asked in that particular essay, and must also address the basics of what was being mentioned in the body of the essay, and must tie up the argument of the discussion. So basically, I think with this is evident enough to equip you to be able to actually prepare yourself for the coming examinations or whichever you are going to meet in the coming sessions. You use this as your referral point whenever you are answering questions, either source-based questions or essay questions. You must always refer back to your skills. These basic skills will make you able to attempt questions in the right way, and will also assist you in answering the questions in the proper historical required prescribed way. So without these skills, you will be wandering around. You must always be able to refer back. In fact, you must keep them at the disposal of your fingertips, such that you always know what to do in a given situation, in a given question situation. You know how you should attempt that particular question based on the skills that you must be having at your disposal. That is basically what you must always uphold. From grade 10 until grade 12, this discussion, I think, is a composite discussion for all history grades, and it must be at your disposal whenever you are getting into an examination, whenever you are doing any history task, or anything to do with history source-based questions and essay questions. That is the basis of what you must apply in the examinations or in your school-based assessments or in any other history task that you might happen to be writing. Right. I hope this discussion is going to be helpful to you. Until we meet in other coming discussions, your host for this discussion was Conrad Mupinguri. Thank you for watching.